I'm Dottie Engler, and I'd like to welcome you here on behalf of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Tonight we're having a conversation with Steven Pinker and Howard Gardner. This is not the first conversation we've had between Steven Pinker and Howard Gardner. Howard suggested, I think it was the very first of what we call the Howard Conversations. Howard is kind enough to agree maybe 2 times a year, maybe 3 times a year. I think this is Howard Month because he's actually going to do 2 of these for us, actually this month. But Howard suggested that we should get Steven Pinker here. And I knew what his topic was, but we always try and make Howard happy here at the Harvard Graduate School of Ed. So I thought, we'll invite Steven, and we will have 47 really intelligent people in the room, and that'll be fine. And I was astonished when we showed up to find that there were probably about 500 really intelligent people acting really obnoxiously because they were all so determined to come in here and hear what the conversation was about. I think it is a tribute both to the interest that people are taking in neuroscience, but also a real tribute to Steven Pinker, who somehow has figured out how to write about very complex subjects in English that many people can understand, and is even more delightful because he sprinkles his books with all sorts of allusions and references that are contemporary, and that's so incredibly refreshing that I think it helps for people to continue to work through material that can often seem very dense and difficult in someone else's hands. So this is the 3rd time I think that Steven has been here, and we are quite delighted to have him here tonight. I did allude to the fact that Howard is going to be conducting another conversation in December. We have most of the things that are going to be happening at the forum on our events calendar here, but one that isn't here is John Seeley Brown, who's the great sort of tech guru, will be here on Thursday, December 5th, and Howard will be doing a conversation with him at that time. It will be on the December calendar, but it isn't on this one, so I just wanted to let you know that. Billy Collins will be here in December, the poet laureate, or last year's poet laureate, but we still like him. And so pick up one of our events calendars as you leave. Howard will tell you a little bit more about Steven, and we assume that you all know a whole lot about Steven because you are certainly here. And I'm sure you know about Howard, but I'll just do the formalities. He is the John H. and Elizabeth Hobbs Professor of Cognition and Education here, and the Adjunct Professor of Psychology here at Harvard. He's a MacArthur Fellow, probably best known for his theory of multiple intelligences. And most recently, Howard and some of his colleagues on the Good Work projects have launched an investigation of the relationship between cutting-edge work in different domains and a sense of social responsibility. This is still a place where you can sometimes hear those words, social responsibility, and they actually mean something. Howard is also chairman of the steering committee of Project Zero and an adjunct professor of neurology at Boston University School of Medicine. He's the author of 20 books and hundreds of articles, and among his books are Good Work When Excellence and Ethics Meet, The Disciplined Mind, What All Students Should Know, Intelligence Reframed, Extraordinary Minds, Leading Minds, Frames of Minds, The Theory of Multiple Intelligence. So I talked about this forum all week as the Great Brains Forum. So I'm delighted that you are here, and I will turn it over to Howard.
Thanks, Dottie. Good evening, everyone. Dottie gave a formal introduction to me. I'm going to give a less formal introduction to Steve. I first heard of Steve something over 20 years ago when he was a graduate student at Harvard and I was a young something or other. And the buzz was that there was this extremely talented budding psychologist who I don't think we realized at the time what a good writer Steve was, but he stood out because he was both an expert on the mysteries of linguistics a la Chomsky, and somebody who was doing important work in thinking about visual perception. And one of the things about psychologists is that we specialize, and some of us specialize in the left hemisphere and some of us specialize in the right hemisphere, and Steve was actually working both sides of the street. And once his synthesizing abilities became evident, it was clear he was also a corpus callosum of unusual powers. I think that Steve was admired mostly within the psychology trade until 1994 when he published The Language Instinct, which was a book which not only made issues about language and linguistics much more clear to those of us outside the field than had been done before, but also established him, as Dottie has said, as an incredibly effective communicator of difficult ideas and a very witty and energized and energetic writer. And followed in quick succession How the Mind Works, Words and Rules, which you talked about here 3 years ago.
3 years ago.
And now this amazing book called The Blank Slate. Amazing not only for its content, but for those of us who know how difficult it is to get a single review in a single newspaper for a book. The amount of publicity around this has been incredible, and I would say deserved. Interesting thing about The Blank Slate is that when there's a blank slate, you can project on it whatever you want. That's sort of the meaning of the image. And rather cleverly, the graphic designers for the poster had a blank slate with Steve's name and my name on it. If you look carefully, you saw the word "with" there. But I can't say how many people saw me in the last few days and said, "I can't wait till you have your debate with Steven Pinker." And the blank slate and the two names was just enough to cause that reflex. Now, there may be a date and an occasion where Steve and I have a debate, though he and I were remarking beforehand, it's good to know what the debate's going to be about before the debate is announced. But I take roles fairly seriously, and I see my role this evening not primarily as a debater, but rather to help Steve bring out his ideas. We will talk for half an hour, 40 minutes or so, and then take questions from the audience, and I may revert to the question role if it seems appropriate. So anyway, that's the informal introduction. My first question is a question just of curiosity, Steve. I'm not a media monitor, yet even in my non-monitoring way, I've been astounded by how many times I've turned on the radio and heard your voice, and how many review outlets and how many Q&As and how many little blank excerpts that I've seen. Can you talk a bit about the last 2 or 3 months and how much publicity you've done, and if you could say a word about what it's felt like too.
Yeah. I've done, I think, probably 80 interviews, combining newspaper, radio, and very occasionally television. Toured to 20 cities in the U.S., the U.K., Ireland, and Canada. Probably done 5 or 6 in-depth interviews, which posted on my website.
These are interviews that somebody else did with you?
Yes, these are like Q&As where not just redacted into a feature article, but where the questions and answers are listed in something close to the way the original exchange went. Probably about 4 or 5 excerpts and a dialogue in Slate magazine with Marty Seligman, where I guess we both were simultaneously plugging our books.
Without straining, can you remember the best and the worst experience you've had in, I'd say, in these interview formats? About the reviews we can talk later, but I'm talking about television, live or radio. Which ones have stood out for you?
Well, let's see, probably the worst was a confrontation that I had with a psychoanalyst in the UK on a BBC radio program. And this was a person who I don't think is very well known here, named Oliver James, who wrote a book called, I'll refer to it as They F You Up. But that's not literally what the book is called. And believe it or not, it's not how they refer to it on the BBC. It comes from the famous Philip Larkin poem, They F You Up, your mom and dad, they may not mean to, but they do. They fill you up with all their faults and add some new ones just for you. And the point of this book was that an updating of the classic psychoanalytic position that the adult's conflicts and miseries and difficulties come from interactions with the person's parents in the first 6 years of life. And one of the messages in the blank slate is that there's very little evidence that that's true, and I think considerable evidence that it's not true, that the role of parents in shaping the personality of the adult child has been greatly overrated. Well, in a sense, this, if that's true, it would call into question a lot of what happens in the 50 minutes on the couch. And this was not lost on Oliver James, who began to berate me over the air and for licensing the abuse of children and neglect of children and loosing all of these evils on the world by making these claims. So much so that the host of the show, who lost control of the dialogue because he was literally haranguing me and not even allowing me a chance to answer the questions, called me in my hotel room that night to apologize. And the BBC never apologizes. So this was that was certainly a low point. It was also on my birthday. And the high point, I would say it also occurred in England, when I had an on-stage dialogue with the novelist Ian McEwan, who many of you might know as the author of Atonement and Enduring Love and Amsterdam. And he was there to explore points of contact between literature and human nature. And that was at the Old Vic Theatre in London. So it was a splendid physical setting, and it was a most enjoyable dialogue, at least for me.
Good, thank you. Right away, I wanted to pursue both the parent psychoanalytic issue and the humanities science issue, but I think we need to begin with this group as freshmen, though quickly get them into graduate school. So, actually, I first heard about this from you about 2 years ago, just informally, when you said you're writing a book called, I believe, The Blank Slate, The Ghost in the Machine, and The Noble Savage. I think that was the working title a couple of years ago. The last two got quite diminished in the book, which itself is not a short book. By the way, I have the only paperback edition. The rest of you have to buy the hardback. What's the most important idea that people should take away from the conversation tonight about from your book? You can do more than one, but okay. not 10.
The main point of the book is that we can't do without a theory of human nature, that there's been a great resistance to the notion that humans have a nature in modern intellectual life for political, moral, and emotional reasons, that on closer scrutiny, none of the fears that people have of a human nature are justified, and therefore we should try to figure out what makes humans tick objectively without putting a moral thumb on either side of the scale, and assuming that any theory that posits any innate drives or any innate talents to humans are necessarily reactionary or nihilistic or necessarily leading to horrific consequences.
Now, I noticed a phrase which other people may not have picked up, but to me it's the most important phrase in what you said, and that's modern intellectual life. The reason I think that's so important is because one of your theses is that the classical philosophers assumed there was a human nature, and so have many scientists as well. So to discuss the nature of human nature would not have been seen as terribly problematic in the past. So when you say modern intellectual life, help us as budding modern intellectuals know why you use that phrase.
Well, I think that there's often a disconnect between what people believe in their hearts and the way they act on those beliefs in everyday life, and what they say when they go into intellectualizing mode, when they write articles for the newspapers or academic journals or statements when they act as activists. An example is that any parent of more than one child knows that children are not indistinguishable lumps of putty waiting to be shaped, that anyone who's ever been in a heterosexual relationship knows that men and women aren't indistinguishable in their personalities. But if you say this in an academic or a policy context, they can be fighting words. They can be inflammatory statements. So part of what I wanted to do in the book was to bring intellectual life back into register with, on the one hand, common sense, and on the other hand, some of the directions that I see the science of human nature heading in.
Now, other than Mr. Oliver James, was that his name, to what extent have you actually run into people, either in print or in interviews or in debates, where they say, you've got it all wrong, either in the sense that nobody really takes this blank slate view, or in the sense that you're mischaracterizing the nature of the positions which they hold. And have you found people who say, I just really disagree fundamentally with what you're saying here, or do most of the people say, well, when you put it this way, it makes a lot of sense?
The first reaction I often get is there anyone who really believes in the blank slate? Is this a straw man? And that's why I began the preface of the book with some quotes of people who had been excoriated for saying that some aspect of human behavior comes from an interaction of nature and nurture, which everyone thinks is the moderate, common sense, bland, unobjectionable position. But in fact, the examples that I use show that, first of all, it's not an unobjectionable position. People do object, and nor is it obviously true in every case. So 3 examples, and I actually have quotes. The first quote is, our position is that in this matter, the evidence is not conclusive. It seems to support a mixture of genes and environment as an explanation. Perfectly bland, mother and apple pie compromise. Well, that was actually a quote from Bernstein and Murray's The Bell Curve, which is their explanation for the racial gap in IQ scores. So it's far from a bland position. It's not necessarily a correct position either, even though it's tempting to say that the truth is always somewhere in the middle between 2 extremes. But in that case, it's neither innocuous to say so, nor is it necessarily true. The second quote was a similar, seemingly namby-pamby, compromise, middle-of-the-road quote, and this was from Judith Rich Harris in her book, The Nurture Assumption, as one of the first people that brought to the attention of people at large findings from behavioral genetics that suggest that the influence of parents on children's personality is almost entirely due to genetics. Not that personality is all in the genes, but that the portion that's not in the genes doesn't seem to come from the parents either, but from other aspects of the environment.
Yeah, you need to expand on that
Yeah.
As a parenthesis, because some people may not know the evidence on which Harris makes that claim.
The people often equate the environment with parents, but parents are not the only part of the environment that impinges on the child. And the argument was first publicized by Judith Rich Harris, but it had actually been made far earlier by Sandra Scarr, Robert Plomin, Frank Sulloway, and David Licken and other behavioral geneticists. And here are two findings. Everyone has read the stories about the identical twins separated at birth, then they're reunited in their 40s, and both of them walk into the lab wearing the same shirt. They both keep rubber bands around their wrists. They both flush the toilet before using it and after using it, and so on. So this shows that what this shows is that there's definitely an effect of genes on personality, because identical twins share all of their genes, but if they're separated at birth, they don't share their environments. But what people don't notice is the other discovery coming out of that research, which is that if the identical twins had been brought up together, now they share not only their genes, but also their parents, their siblings, their neighborhood, their school, their homes, and so on. They are no more similar, having grown up together, than if they had grown up apart. Now that's a second shocker, one that...
Though your example isn't too helpful there, because you described them as being identical apart, so they couldn't be any more similar. But what I think you're saying is, even if they didn't flush the toilet the same way, it's not any more likely they would do it if they're in the same home.
That's right. Did I say it backwards? But
well, no, it's just that you already made them seem so identical. You had a ceiling effect.
A ceiling effect, yes. No. If you take, say, quantitative measurements of correlation, say, in IQ tests, personality tests, likelihood of divorcing, number of cigarettes smoked per day, number of hours of television watched, and so on, the correlations in identical twins reared apart are nowhere near 100%, but they're much greater than zero. If they grow up together, the correlations are the same. That is, they're no higher. So the first finding is that growing up in the same home versus different homes doesn't seem to make siblings more or less alike. Whatever similarity you find in siblings is entirely due to their genes. The differences are partly due to their genes and partly due to something else that can't be correlated with growing up in a given home. The mirror image of that design is looking at adoptive siblings who grow up in the same home. Now, they share most of their home environment and don't share their genes. And the finding there is that when tested as adults, they're no more similar than two people picked off the street at random. So two designs, same genes, different environment, same environment, different genes. And in both cases, genes matter but don't determine the characteristics of the person. But growing up in the same home adds nothing to the similarity or dissimilarity. Then the third set of findings are studies from developmental psychology that I'm sure many people in this room are familiar with, that there are quite radical variations in parenting arrangements that seem to have no lasting effect on major aspects of personality. Whether the child goes to daycare or has a stay-at-home mom, whether the child is brought up by two lesbians or by one specimen of each gender, whether they, putting it as neutrally as possible, whether the child has grows up in an Ozzie and Harriet home or a hippie commune, whether the child's father dies in childhood or not, holding constant things like socioeconomic status and subculture. So these are three bodies of literature. I'll give it a fourth one. Children of immigrants. If they have access to a native-born peer group, they will be, as far as we can tell, as well socialized, as socially competent as children of native-born parents. So that's a fourth literature. So all of these suggest that the effect of having a given set of parents in a given home, holding SES and culture constant, is probably very close to zero.
Now we all see why Oliver James reacted the way he did.
Yes, right. So whiling away your 50 minutes reminiscing about how your parents treated you is may not be the best use of the $120 for 50 minutes.
Yeah.
I'll have to add one thing to sum it up, that Judith Rich Harris, in response to Philip Larkin and anticipating Oliver James, wrote a small poem in defense of Mr. and Mrs. Larkin, which I will recite. How sharper than a serpent's tooth to hear your child make such a fuss. It isn't fair, it's not the truth. He's fucked up, yes, but not by us.
Well, I think Steve's example of the material on parents and their effect or non-effect on their children apart from their genes will convey very effectively to you that this is not a book that's devoid of controversy, nor that to simply say it's a combination of genes and environment is enough to reveal what the real contentions could be, because nobody's going to take nobody will take a position on anything interesting that is completely genetic or completely environmental. I mean, as Steve points out in the book, I mean, you won't speak Japanese if you're raised in English homes or vice versa, but that's not an interesting kind of genetic versus environmental explanation. Let me simply say, just for the record, that Steve was very instrumental in bringing Judith Rich Harris's book to the attention of the public, including me. It is very controversial. My guess is that most people on this street, including me, either don't believe it or don't want to believe it. Those are not the same things. But what those of us who don't want to believe it or don't believe it are then challenged to do is to say, well, how could we find evidence that would support a different interpretation, a different role of parents, a more important role of parents, and we could talk about that. But at present, if you simply look at the behavioral genetics literature, it doesn't give much hope to those who want to be able to demonstrate empirically through either intellectual or what you call socialization measures that the parental contribution above and beyond genetics is easily documented. Let me ask you now, I mean, I've written books, you've written books. Maybe you do more pre-screening than I do, but I have found typically when I write a book, until it's out and I take it on the road and I talk to people, there are often things in it that I wish I had said differently, or that I'd emphasized more, or that I wish I'd left out. And we can write other books, we can even produce other editions, but have you rethought or rewritten anything in your own mind since the book appeared?
Not much, although it only came out 2 months ago in England and 6 weeks ago in the U.S. I think I would, if I were to change anything, it may be just emphasizing to a greater extent that it's not a dead issue, nor has that is nature and nurture. That it's not going to go away if only we understood the molecular biology better, which is the reaction of a number of biologists. Well, won't it go away when we finally understand how second messengers impinge on the genes, and therefore the environment can have an effect on the genes as well as the genes directly on behavior. And if we were to trace out all the causal arrows and had one big spaghetti-like diagram at the level of the molecules, wouldn't that sort of make everything go away? I think I would emphasize how there are significant issues that even though it's never the case that, except for rare examples like, say, Huntington's disease, where anything is completely genetic or completely environmental, what exactly the interaction is an interesting empirical issue that we have to study. In the case of language, what is the child born with that allows language acquisition to happen? How does it interact with input from parents or peers to result in words and rules and grammatical constructions? In the case of personality development, since I think the keystone finding is that identical twins reared together don't correlate perfectly, nowhere near perfectly. And that, I think, refutes every theory in the history of psychology, because the identical twins not only share their genes, but the parents, the schools, the neighborhood, the siblings, the TV sets in the house, the books in the house, the guns in the house, and so on. Nonetheless, they are not identical. Only if you first subtract out the genetic contribution can you realize that there is this massive source of unexplained variance, which poses a huge challenge for psychology and more generally for developmental biology. But that really is a mystery that I would like to see addressed as one of many that only can be addressed when you take nature and nurture seriously and try to disentangle them, as opposed to saying, well, it's just everything affects everything else, and let's not even think about it.
But you put more of an emphasis on fate and probability in your discussions than I would have thought. Want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it's another, in fact, I should have mentioned that in connection with this finding, because, well, think about it. Let's go back to these identical twins. What makes them different? If it's not the parents, the genes, and so on. I mean, there aren't a whole lot of possibilities. One possibility that is, I'll just make it even more concrete. There are identical twins reared together where one of them is gay and one of them is straight, for example, or one of them is schizophrenic and the other one is not. So try to explain that with any theory you've ever heard from any camp, and you can't, simply because any theory that tries to identify a causal variable will have to recognize that all of the causal variables, or at least the vast majority of them, are going to be identical for identical twins reared together. So what that suggests is that chance has to play a role. Now, what does that mean? It could be chance in the wiring of the brain, that is, in utero, since there are nowhere near enough genes to specify the wiring diagram of the brain down to the last synapse. It could be that in one twin, a growth cone of an axon zigs, and another one it zags, and that creates...
Well, one is often bigger anyway and comes out first and so on, right?
Well, that's another possibility. That is, indeed, that because identical twins compete, they basically compete over placenta, one of them can crowd out the other. So that's another source. And it could be chance events in your life that you happen to come across an interesting friend while your identical twin was at the other end of the playground, and you immediately hit it off, and you then start to specialize more and more in whatever personality trait allows you to get along with that friend as opposed to some other friend that you might have bumped into if you hung around the other end of the playground that day. So when I refer to fate, I don't mean fate in the sense of strict predestination of the fates sort of spinning out your life, and you're on trolley tracks for your 70 years, but rather fate in the sense of uncontrollable fortune. That is something that neither you nor a social scientist could have identified a priori and predicted would have the impact that it does.
I think pretty soon I want to take some questions, though I've got a lot left, but might break it up a bit. Just don't have to listen to me questioning all the time. But chance events, there was something you referred to in the book, and I actually thought a lot about it with reference to the general claims you're making, and that is that you were growing up in Montreal, born in 1954, and when you were a teenager, was this the late 60s, early 70s, there was a police strike? Tell us about it. And
Yes.
Tell us about how you describe it in the book.
Yes, well, I was when I was 14, I was an anarchist.
Still in certain respects.
My best friend was as I used to call him, a red diaper baby. That is, his parents were communists, and he was kind of brought up steeped in Marx and Bakunin and Kropotkin. In fact, he was an anarchist, and it kind of convinced me to be a romantic anarchist. That kind of in the Rousseau tradition, that if we didn't have to delineate property for the state to recognize, we would spontaneously share it. And if we didn't have social institutions that sort of pitted us against each other, we would live in harmony, as Rousseau would have put it, the noble savages do. So that was one quirk of growing up in Montreal at that time, was having this anarchist friend, and also it being the late 60s. Anarchism was kind of in the air. Revolution for the hell of it. Who needs the police? Who needs the government? Well, another quirk of Montreal is that it has a kind of Gallic political system in which the civil servants are constantly going on strike. So one week it was the bus drivers, the next week it was the letter carriers, then it was the nurses. Well, then it was the police's turn. And one day the police went on strike. And this is, it was if Rousseau were ever to have a chance, it would have to be in Montreal, because we Canadians are very proud of our low rate of violent crime compared to the United States. Canada's a very famously civil society. And so the police went on strike. People's, the better angels of our nature would express themselves, and nothing much would happen. Well, within a couple of hours, There was rioting and looting downtown. People were breaking into jewelry stores and appliance stores. There was a doctor killed a burglar in his home. Several fires were set. There was an ongoing labor dispute between a taxi company and a limousine service competing over airport customers, and the taxi drivers burned down the garage of the limo service. So basically all hell broke loose, and finally they had to call in the Mounties to restore order. So this, I think, sort of left my anarchism in tatters. And my parents, who, as parents often do, they may not shape their personality, but they do have a certain amount of wisdom. And they had, over the dinner table, they had long said, well, thank God for the police. If there weren't police, all hell would break loose. And so they got to have their nya that day. And that was the end of my career as an anarchist. I now believe that a democratically controlled police and rule of law is a very good thing.
I brought that up, though, with a certain malice of forethought in mind, because, I'll speak for myself now. I think I do have a lot more respect for the role of parents in raising kids on issues of personality than the Judith Rich Harris position suggests. And I also have a lot more respect for what a good psychoanalyst can do in helping people deal with their past and their personalities. And so when I read that, it immediately said to me, this is Steve, first in conflict with his parents, but then also having an event which could have been very decisive in your scientific and political nature. And I think one of the problems is a lot of things that we believe strongly may not be true, and that's why the Pinker book is very interesting. On the other hand, if we believe them strongly, the challenge is to be able to show ways in which a skeptic would be convinced by it, and both in the case of the parental role and in the case of the power of psychoanalysis, I think that the burden of proof has shifted to a certain extent. But you are not immune from either of those factors. Right? Okay, well, why don't we take some questions from the audience, and I've also got some stored up, but I'm sure that, yes, over there on the wall.
I actually haven't read the book, but I'm going to read it soon, so I don't know if you can address this. But what about the idea that the two children, brother and sister, aren't the sort of identical family environments? That in fact, children in families have very different roles in the family. Parents see them very differently in relationships. Their temperaments might contribute to that changes their experience.
Yeah, that is a good question, which I do deal with in the chapter on children.
Could people hear the question? Okay.
I think there are a number of reasons to think that the different parental treatment of children, depending on their family niche, does not affect their personality. Although in my 1997 book, How the Mind Works, I actually gave that hypothesis much more credence than I would today. One reason to doubt it is that even if parents treat their children differently, you'd also expect there to be an average difference between one set of parents and another. That is, let's say you're more indulgent to the child who is gentler and have higher expectations and are stricter for the child who seems more independent. Well, that makes sense, but then you'd also expect that if you took a large sample of parents, some would be, on average, across all of their children, or if they only had one child, with one child, be more indulgent than some other parent. But then if you compare kids growing up in the same family with kids growing up in different families, then holding genetics constant, there is no effect. So unless the parental reaction to the child is so uniquely determined that there are no traits that parents have on average that make them treat several of their children differently, even on average, from the way another parent would treat several of their children, then the hypothesis that the unique treatment is decisive, I don't think can work. A second kind of evidence comes from studies of birth order, where Contrary to popular belief and contrary to my own belief a few years ago, there seem to be virtually no effects of birth order on long-term personality, at least in terms of how you relate to people outside the family itself. Obviously, a firstborn and a laterborn within the family deal differently with one another, and each of them deals differently with the parents. But if you look at how they behave to people outside the home, then a number of massive studies have shown that holding SES constant, there's no effect. Firstborn, fifthborn, only child, makes no difference. And then the third kind of evidence that leads me to doubt that unique parental treatment matters is a large-scale study done by, it came out in 2000. I forget the first author, but Robert Plomin was one of the co-authors. I think he was there basically to make sure that the genetic controls were done properly. But they tried using path analysis to separate out the traits the child was born with, the parental treatment of the child that could be predicted by the child's inherent characteristics. That is, parents treat kids differently because kids are different to some extent, and ways in which parents treated children that weren't completely predictable by the child's own innate tendencies, and found that virtually all of the differential treatment of children by parents was simply reacting to the child's different temperaments that they had to begin with. And they couldn't detect any additional effect of the parental behavior on the child that wasn't simply a reaction to the way the child was to begin with. So even though the question that you raised is, I think, logically valid in that the studies that I alluded to in response to Howard's question don't rule out effects of differential treatment, these three kinds of evidence, I think, make it unlikely.
Yes, in the first row there.
I'm interested in looking at this through a political kaleidoscope. Can everybody hear me?
You may as well use the mic since you haven't.
It's scary. In other words, you talk about how you arrive at these conclusions without a moral thumb. And I don't see how anybody really ever does that. And also how it might explain the popularity or the publicity that your book has engendered, because finally those who feel that nobody influences anyone, the blank slate is at least closer to God than Freud or psychology.
Well, a lot of the book is on the political and moral implications or non-implications about particular claims about human nature. The discussion that Howard and I just had on whether, say, humans have, whether violence and antisocial behavior are products of social institutions or rather are part of human nature and are controlled by social institutions, has implications for whether you're an anarchist. I think only a romantic who believes in the noble savage can be an anarchist. To some extent, it delineates some of the left-wing and right-wing political philosophies, which, when they were first articulated, were very clearly statements about human nature. Hobbes versus Rousseau. Hobbes believed that we needed a Leviathan, a government with a armed police to keep us from each other's throats. I think Hobbes was closer to the truth than Rousseau in that regard. Economic organization depends on whether you believe that, say, as Adam Smith did, that we get our bread from the baker not because of his generosity, but because of his selfishness, as opposed to Marx, who said, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. So depending on whether you believe that humans are inherently communal or have some strain of selfishness, you'll be more receptive to free market versus Marxist economic systems. If you believe that people are innately indistinguishable, then you will attribute every aspect of inequality, of outcome, that is differences in status and income, to discrimination or social barriers, whereas if you believe that people vary from one another, individual from individual, then you expect some inequality of outcome, even if the playing field is perfectly level. So these are some of the ways in which assumptions about human nature do interact with political positions. What I tried very hard in the book to not make it a brief for left-wing or right-wing political beliefs across the board, although I have opinions on issue by issue. And the reason is that most interesting policy debates or political disputes involve a trade-off. And you can have more of one thing at the expense of less of something else. So even if individuals differ from one another innately in talent, in drive, in responsibility, in intelligence, and so on, does that mean that we should therefore have a completely laissez-faire society in which all you do is enforce fair trade rules and let people end up with however much wealth or status they end up with at the end of the day and sacrifice all notions of social justice or income redistribution? Well, it doesn't imply that, because there is some good to be had in fairness and freedom. There's some good to be had in reducing inequality. What the fact of human differences simply tells us is that these two goods will sometimes be at odds with one another. That if you have perfect freedom, you're not going to have perfect equality of outcome, or vice versa, and that different political philosophies can be arrayed in terms of how much value they give to each of these goods. So if you're an extreme Ayn Randian objectivist ultra-libertarian, you would say that inequality of outcome should matter not at all, and we should simply have people compete, and whoever ends up with the most toys wins. If you're a Maoist, you would say that the only good is equality, and we have to hammer down the nail that sticks up. And then various other positions would be in between. So my argument is we have to recognize that there is a trade-off. We have to argue for what's the most humane point along that trade-off, but that it's not my goal in this book to argue what that optimal point in the trade-off is. And many other issues, again, involve these competing goods.
On page 293, you have a very interesting sentence, which I'd like you to expand a bit on. You said, "My own view is that the new sciences of human nature really do vindicate some version of the tragic vision and undermine the utopian outlook that until recently dominated large segments of intellectual life." So you have taken a position, somewhat other than in the center of 2 points of view.
Yeah. This comes in a chapter on politics where I outline two, I think, dimensions of debate on human nature that are correlated, not perfectly, but I think to a large extent with left-wing and right-wing views. One of them is whether you conceive of society as a starting point, as a cohesive entity of which the individual humans are components, like cells of the body, as opposed to thinking of human individuals as the starting point and society as the result of some social contract that individuals, in a sense, negotiate to adjudicate their conflicts. And not perfectly, but to some extent, the society as organism has been more popular in recent decades on the left, and the society as social contract among individuals more popular on the right. And the example I give is that in the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson had a program that he called the Great Society, and in Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau had the Just Society, and these were both sort of the epitome of 60s liberalism. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher said, "There's no such thing as society. There are men and women and children, and there are families, and that's all." So that's one dimension, although it's not perfectly correlated, because there are conservatives who believe that society is a cohesive entity and vice versa. But the other dimension, and I think that captures probably more of the variance, comes from a book by Thomas Sowell called A Conflict of Visions, in which the two visions were what he later called the tragic vision, and which I call the opposing one, which I think can be called the utopian vision, which is, according to the tragic vision, which is traditionally more associated with the right. Humans are fundamentally limited in wisdom, in generosity, in selflessness, in honesty, and all social arrangements have to acknowledge those limitations. According to the utopian vision, these flaws are products of society, and we shouldn't allow them to blind us to what's possible, in a better designed society of the future. And that a lot of the right-left controversies that would otherwise seem to have nothing in common fall out of that distinction. Like why, if you know someone is in favor of a strong military, you can bet that they're probably opposed to abortion, that, or at least above chance, you predict that they're less likely to oppose, to favor shocking art, that they'd have a more traditionalist approach to education, back to basics as opposed to constructivism, that they'd be less sympathetic to the environmentalist and green movements. And first,
now, to what extent have you just described yourself?
Oh,
we'll ask your wife for corroborating.
I'll give you this corroboration. Where do I stand politically? I once took as a psychologist, I strongly believe in objective quantitative measures, and I took a test on the internet of political where you stand politically. This is from a UK site, and it claimed that that the first two dimensions in the factor analysis of political beliefs were left moderate right as one dimension, and authoritarian libertarian as the other dimension, and that you could place many people in these four quadrants. So I took the test, and it had me on the left-right dimension. It had me as a moderate, and in the authoritarian libertarian dimension, it had me partway into the libertarian range. So, and I think that was, I tend to believe that objective tests are probably better than any self-advertisement or how I'd like to appear. So I'll live with that. But anyway, just to get back to your question, I think that so you have the tragic vision saying, well, we're going to need some kind of democratically controlled police force and rule of law, that people aren't just going to make nice if you leave them to their own devices, that probably an economic system that acknowledges self-interest is likely to be more productive and humane than one that has people contribute everything to the collective pot, that there are bad people out there, and so that we are not necessarily going to be able to rehabilitate every last psychopath. Now, these, I think, nowadays are no longer considered reactionary beliefs. They probably would have been in the 60s and perhaps in the 70s. And I think all of these beliefs, the way in which the sort of political consensus, say, has shifted away from the romanticism of the late 60s and 70s, I think involves an acknowledgement of human nature, of the fact that that, as one reviewer of the book put it, and I'll leave it as that as one of the best summations of the message. The reviewer said that the message of the blank slate is, we are not stardust, we are not golden, there is no way we're getting back to the garden, get used to it. And the people who are laughing know that this comes from the song Woodstock by Joni Mitchell.
By the way, Steve might be too modest to bring this up, but those of us who are on Ron Unz's email got something yesterday in the mail which said, you won't believe it, but The Nation, which is the closest thing to a completely left libertarian publication, has published a 4,000 words, that's a long review, completely endorsing Steven Pinker's book. Now, for his own reasons, Ron Unz likes that, but it does really suggest a huge kind of sea change, in the sense that even if this review had been received in the 60s, it probably would have been killed by the editor.
I'll just add one thing just to sort of close off this discussion, that in the chapter on politics, I do mention that it's been the right that traditionally have been more comfortable with the notion of human nature than the left, but that there has been a change. I mean, the review in The Nation didn't shock me, because At the end of this chapter, I had a survey of the new Darwinian left. It's an expression that came from Peter Singer in a book by that title. But people like Peter Singer, Robert Frank, Robert Wright, my colleague Noam Chomsky, Bob Trivers, all have a fairly strong innatist vision of human nature, but nonetheless are on the left rather than on the right, so that the traditional equation is starting to be upended.
Thank you, and I think that's an important thing to say in this audience, because I think most of us would have been disinclined to recognize that realignment. Other questions? All the way in the back there with the mic? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'm interested in the tools that you use to measure and compare human beings. I'm a teacher in Massachusetts, and the state has a great interest in measuring my students and understanding who they are, and so they've designed vast tests to try to figure out who they are. And as a teacher, I know the test reveals so little of who these students are. So I'm wondering how you come to trust whatever measures it is that you compare one person to another to see if they're alike or different. Plaid shirts and rubber band wrists and toilet flushing habits are interesting, but far away from who the people are.
Yeah. Most of the book is actually on what people have in common, and it's really only the chapter on children that focuses on differences among individuals within a culture. But that research that I allude to on differences uses the interesting conclusion is it almost doesn't matter what you use. One recent survey of this research by Eric Turkheimer, a behavioral geneticist, said that the first law of behavioral genetics is that all behavioral traits are partly heritable. Heritable meaning that some of the variation in the trait is correlated with genetic variation, and within a particular ethnic group and subculture. Now, what do these studies actually use? Some of them use IQ tests, either measures of general intelligence, that is, the way in which different subtests correlate with one another, or individual components such as verbal and mathematical intelligence. Standard personality inventories such as the MMPI and similar tests, which have people fill out a checklist of 550 statements that they agree with or disagree with, which are then statistically crunched into a smaller number of factors like how neurotic or self-confident, how conscientious versus irresponsible, how outgoing versus introverted, and so on. And measures of actual behavior, such as likelihood of divorcing, number of criminal convictions, number of hours of television watched, graduation from high school, and so on. Even tests of political opinions, like the one that I gave myself on the internet. Liberal and conservative beliefs are partly, though not nowhere near completely heritable. So the interesting finding is it almost doesn't matter what you measure, that the generalization is that virtually everything, as long as it's not obviously tied to something that you could only acquire from the environment, such as the particular religion that you grow up in or the particular language that you speak, has some degree of heritability that is greater than 0 and less than 100%.
I think, though, Stephen, right? I think he may have been getting at something different. Let's take a look at your own students. You've had probably 50 students who you've got to know well over the past 20 years. And you have some information about what they're like because you see their graduate record exams or whatever. But I'll ask the question, which will reveal how I feel about this. I often think that doesn't begin to get me into what those students are like and what I would really want to write about them, and as I get to understand them better, what their strengths and weaknesses are. And those instruments are exceedingly blunt. And Stephen, who teaches middle school kids, probably takes a look at the MCAS or even an IQ and says, God, this doesn't begin to capture what I think is important. Answering as Steve Pinker, the human being, as opposed to Steve Pinker, the reader of the MMPIs. I mean, how do you react to that? Do you think we're romanticizing?
No, I mean, it may be a question of whether the glass is half empty or half full. I mean, the way I would put it is that something like a GRE score, I wouldn't say it doesn't begin to capture the person. I think it begins, but it only begins. And I'm sure anyone who's admitted graduate students and seen how they've fared in a graduate program, for example, knows that they're, on average, you want someone with a better score than someone with a worse score, but there are people with a stratospheric scores who bomb out because they can't get along with people, or they have no sense of what makes humans tick, and they really should study mathematics or worms or something other than humans. There are people who have no curiosity, even though they are good at filling out tests. There are all kinds of reasons that people, given a high test score, will not be good scientists of the human mind. And conversely, there are people, I don't think there are a lot of people with really bad test scores, in my experience, who will be successful scientists of the human mind. But it's not always the best ones who are the best scientists, because it also hinges on creativity, on intuitive feel for what makes other people tick that lead to productive hypotheses, green thumb, all the other things that go into the mixture.
Good. Where's the mic? Okay, I guess we're going to follow the mic, follow the money. Where's the mic? Okay, well, please.
I had a question about you mentioned earlier your mistrust of the effectiveness of the hour on the couch psychoanalysis. So how would you then address the apparent success that it's had over the last century?
Well, the success of psychotherapy, of course, is a matter of fierce debate. I think there's very little evidence that the psychoanalytic approaches in particular, that is, that look for the roots of the adult conflict in childhood treatment, are particularly effective. Psychotherapy is effective, or at least it can be, almost independently of the theory and the approach, I think depending much more on the personal characteristics of the psychotherapist, or at least this is my reading of the literature, and that by and large the field of psychotherapy has moved very strongly away from psychoanalytic assumptions, with a few holdouts such as probably Manhattan and Cambridge. That by and large most therapists now are much more oriented to the here and now, or to what strategies are going to work in your life now. Don't try to blame it on your parents. Here you are, you're 40 years old. These are your problems. What's going to help you solve them? And mixed with inappropriate cases with drugs, say in cases of severe depression or severe anxiety. So it's not that psychotherapy is ineffective, but rather psychotherapy that's wedded to the assumption that the way you are treated in the first 6 years of life is crucial. That I think there's no evidence for.
But let me follow up with that, if I may. While I certainly don't see myself as somebody who would want to debate everything in the book, I've done a lot of self-examination about what makes me uncomfortable in the book. And I guess one of the things I'd like you to comment on is whether, when you live in different societies at different times, the concerns and the responses on measures might be very, very different. So let me be concrete in two senses. I mean, psychoanalysis developed in Middle Europe at the end of the 19th century for people, as my own teacher, Erik Erikson, pointed out, for certain kinds of problems, sexual ones, and ones who came from certain kinds of families. And as one moves away from that milieu, clearly it's going to be less relevant. When I try to think about what I don't like in the Judith Rich Harris studies, it's basically that they're basically done in the United States in the last 40 or 50 years. And I think the United States is, in the human sphere, an extraordinarily peer-oriented culture. Moreover, I think that the faster things change, the more you have to look at peers, because the ancestors don't have the answers, so to speak. And so before closing the book and saying, yes, Judith, I give up, you're right, I'd like to be wise enough and have enough data to know whether psychoanalysis always stinks, no matter where you do it and when you do it, and similarly whether the peers always way trump the parents, or whether we're really studying a certain society, a certain historical moment. So whether or not you want to comment on that, I guess I am very interested in the extent to which historical and cultural circumstances ought to be something that we factor in majorly when we're talking about, if not human nature, human natures.
Yeah, certainly. Well, the conclusions about the, by the way, about the size of the effect of genes are always holding culture constant. That is, the studies don't claim, or at least shouldn't claim to explain, say, the difference between, medieval France and modern U.S., or between the way I put it in one interview, I said, they can't explain the difference between, say, the growing up in Yanomamo culture in the Amazon rainforest versus, say, the child of Jewish doctors in Manhattan. And the interviewer said, yes, the fierce people. But going back to the relative influence of peers in both in solving this mystery of the non-genetic component of personality, and more generally as to whether in different countries or different historical periods peers have more or less of an effect. One of my disagreements with Judith Rich Harris is that I think she at times runs together the source of socialization, that is, acquiring the knowledge and skills that allow you to function in your society, and personality. And I think she's actually right about socialization, that children are socialized much more by their peers than by their parents. Immigration is the perfect way of unconfounding them. You have a child growing up with American peers and immigrant parents from any part of the world that you want to name, and the child will end up like the peers, not the parents, often not even a compromise between them. In the case of language, I think that's the clearest, where the accent will always go with the peers, never with the parents, and rarely, if ever, even halfway in between. But that doesn't help solve the problem of differences in personality, that is, whether you're shy or outgoing, conscientious or irresponsible, open to experience or set in your ways, and so on. The reason that I don't think that peer groups can solve that puzzle is that if we go back to the reference case of the identical twins reared together, they're not perfectly correlated in their personalities, but they do, on average, have the same peers. So it can't be that whether you're bold or shy depends on which peer group you grow up in, because you can have two kids genetically identical in the same peer group, but with differences in their personalities. So that's one comment on the limits of the explanatory power of peers. In terms of whether we live at a point in history and in a particular culture in which peers have an outsized influence, there is a chapter in the Harris book on more traditional societies, on hunter-gatherer and hunter-horticultural societies. And if anything, I think one might argue that we live in a culture in which parents have been given have a much stronger role than they would have in traditional societies, where in a lot of peasant societies...
Well, that's one kind of traditional society.
Yes.
It's not...
No, it's true. It's not, say, Vienna at the turn of the century. Yes. Fair enough. But, nowadays... in much of the third world and in many hunter-gatherer societies and hunter-horticultural societies, as soon as the child is weaned, they're pretty much dumped into a peer group. If they have an older sibling, the older sibling they'll tag along after the older sibling. But they'll spend most of their time in mixed age and, if depending on how big the group is, mixed sex groups of peers. The kind of round-the-clock parent or round-the-clock mother is probably more of a historical artifact than the being socialized in a group of other kids. Again, granted that it will vary decade by decade. Nowadays, there's this concept of parents arranging play dates for their children, and even the peer interactions are under the control of the parents, as opposed to kind of 50s neighborhood where the mom would open the door and the kids go out and come back in time for dinner. So there are differences, but I'm not sure that they would give parents less of a role and peers more of a role nowadays than they would have in other societies.
Good. Is the mic in a certain locus? Yes.
I'd like to ask you about when you talked about the role of the role of chance, in personality development. Your playground example was a good one, where a chance interaction can lead to development in a particular way. An organism following sort of a space filling curve and going out in a kind of in a niche that isn't filled. And I'm wondering how you go about studying that, because it strikes me that the role of personality and sort of innate personality, or up to that point, whatever might be partly genetically determined, has a role. In other words, someone who is more aggressive in following opportunities and meeting people, someone who is maybe more shy and so draws particular kind of interactions in. So it's sort of nonplussed as to how you go about studying that and attributing what part of the outcome comes from the chance and what part comes from particular predilection that might have led to taking advantage of an opportunity which was itself chance.
Yeah. It would be expensive and complicated and frustrating to study, because what you would have to do is basically mount a webcam on the the child's eyeglasses or baseball cap and record all of these unique experiences, and then over a large sample of kids, hopefully, best of all, including large numbers of twins, full sibs, half sibs, and unrelated children, see if anything could be predicted from unique experiences with or without interaction of genetic predispositions. So it's doable. It's not the kind of thing that would be a whole lot of fun to do, because there would be so many things that one could look at, and data of orders of magnitude more complicated than the ones that we in social science are used to dealing with. Since by definition, if these are unique experiences, you never know which is the one that might have a causal effect. And indeed, it's also possible that none of them have a causal effect, that it really is whether you were at this angle or that angle in the womb, or whether a neuron zigged or zagged. So it's studyable, but it would be horrendously difficult to study. I mean, that's the sort of the bad news.
Yeah. Again, if you have a question, and we have time for a few more questions, because I got 3 more I want to ask, catch the eye of the mic holder, because the power is in the mic. Yeah, please.
You mentioned, I think one of your colleagues said, if you're right, how depressed she would be at all the hours she had spent trying to create this environment. And I thought your response was great, because it sort of flips the whole idea of, it gives another really refreshing view of parenting that I think sometimes gets forgotten. If you could just remind me of...
Oh, yeah. Why? I mean, a common response is a common reaction to the finding that parents don't seem to be able to shape their children's personality is, oh, so you're saying it doesn't matter how I treat my child? Now, of course it matters. It matters, first of all, because it's never acceptable to beat or neglect or abuse a child, because those are horrible things for a big, strong person to do to a helpless little person who's under their care. And parenting is, above all, an ethical responsibility. Again, I'm going to quote Harris, because she does have, I think, a gift for pith. Said, we may not hold our children's tomorrows in our hands, but we hold their todays in our hands, and we have the power to make them very miserable. And the other reason is that parents and children have a human relationship. And if I were to tell you that you don't have the ability to shape the personality of your spouse, I don't think that would be terribly controversial. Only a newlywed believes you can change the personality of your spouse. But nonetheless, the reaction wouldn't be, oh, so you're saying it doesn't matter how I treat my spouse. Of course it matters. It matters to the quality of your relationship. And your people are nice to their husbands or wives, or at least they should be, in order to build a deep and satisfying and rewarding relationship over the long term. And likewise, children grow up. They the relationship with their parents is one of the most important of their lives, together with the relationship with their spouse. And how parents treat the child affects the quality of that relationship. I mean, just to put it really crudely, the other day I saw a bumper sticker that said, "Be nice to your children, they'll choose your nursing home." Now, that puts it a little more crudely than I would like, but it does capture the idea that children grow up with memories of how they were treated, and just as any human relationship depends on how one person treats the other, so the most important relationship of all between a parent and child will be affected by how the parents behave. In fact, I think it is one of the signs of the tenacity of the blank slate that people think of parenting only in terms, or at least when they intellectualize. I don't think anyone in real life believes this. When they intellectualize, they think of parenting only in terms of shaping the child's personality and intellect. And the first reaction upon hearing the claim that that's not possible is to say, well, there's no reason to be nice to my child at all. Fortunately, I don't think anyone behaves that way. But in intellectualizing mode, that's the first reaction that people have, I think, because of the blank slate.
A couple more questions with the mic over there.
Yeah, I have a question about, and I think I have to ask it in three parts. But basically, what do you make of the role of narrative? Because, the one reason why I think...
We're not going to give you time for more than one question. So
no,
ask,
it is one question, but
okay.
basically the role of narrative, because people
30
tell
seconds.
stories. and that's one reason why we think that our parents influence us. And then the role of learning. People learn things and unlearn things. And wouldn't it be human nature, in one sense, that makes it hard to study that aspect because of how humans remember and they don't fill in all the pieces?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You understand my question? Okay.
Yeah, I do.
Thank you.
No, that is certainly true. That people are all constantly writing their autobiography. I mean, in their own minds, and the self that they present to other people is often a self that is a character in this autobiography, and indeed that autobiography often includes how you were treated by parents. What I'm saying is that like many autobiographies, it may not be accurate. That people, especially since if you're not adopted, you really don't know simply because of the confounded variables, what part of yourself really came about from the way you were treated as opposed to what you inherited, as opposed to all of these other factors such as culture, the surrounding culture, and chance. So I don't deny that parents are very important in people's narratives, personal narratives, but people might be mistaken as to how important they really were.
Okay, one last question, whoever holds the mic.
I thought that what you said about the correlation between twins reared apart being the same as twins reared together would say that the peers don't matter any more than the parents do. But the idea of correlation here, and I'll come at you from the same direction as several other people, seems to me pretty, inadequate maybe. And it's illustrated by the fact to me that you've used the word personality many times and never the word character. I think of character as kind of the channel through which the energy of personality flows. If you have someone who has, you might say, aggressive tendencies, they might become a thief or a football star. And those things seem to me like language or a religion, the things that are available to them to learn in their particular environment, which shape their personality into a character which produces a vastly significant difference between people who might correlate the same way on the tests you're talking about.
Yeah. No, that is a valid point, that the fact that twins reared together have the same correlation as twins reared apart does rule out different peer groups as an explanation for the non-genetic component of personality. So I agree with you there, and indeed this is where I think the limits on the explanatory power of peer groups shows itself. I think that in socialization, whether you speak English or French with or without an accent, what music you listen to, whether you know how to drive, how to open up a bank account, all of those things, I think you do learn much more from peers in the surrounding culture than from your parents. But personality and indeed character, for the very reason you mentioned, can't be attributed to differences in peer groups because the twins brought up together will have the same peer group on average. In terms of the difference between personality and character, I mean, granted, character is harder to study than personality. For personality, there are all of these quantitative batteries, which, considering how how dumb they are. They actually don't do a bad job at predicting things. That is, if you have someone fill out an MMPI, the digest that you get after all of the numbers are crunched correlates reasonably well with things like how someone else would describe the person, whether they get into trouble with the law, whether they're likely to get divorced, whether they're likely to get into trouble with the law, and so on. So I think when I talk about personality in the psychometrician sense, it has some predictiveness in real life, and at least it overlaps with character, although I don't think we have great measures of character. So for example, these tests do measure things like whether you have a Machiavellian personality and you're constantly looking to exploit people, or whether you're basically more sympathetic to people, whether you're conscientious and responsible or lackadaisical and irresponsible. So there is an overlap between personality and character, although it is granted a statistical overlap, and all of these predictive relationships that I've alluded to are only statistical. That is, there's a great deal of variation that is not predicted by anything that we know how to measure.
Thank you. Steve, by the rules, we have about 5 more minutes, so nothing really happens at 7:30 except you deserve a break and a thank you. I want to ask you about 3 more things. One, a question about Steve Pinker's intellectual development. Second, about the arts and humanities and their relationship to human nature. And finally, since we're at a school of education and most people here are going to be educators of one sort or another, whether this ought to influence what we do every day, and if so, in which ways. So let me turn first to Steve Pinker. If I were doing an article for the New Yorker, I might say, well, Steve Pinker began by really being a complete devotee of Noam Chomsky, and then there was a kind of a parting of the ways, possibly in theoretical linguistics or in technical linguistics, but also in terms of evolution and its relationship to language, where you take quite different positions. Then you became extremely involved with evolutionary psychology, particularly Tooby and Cosmides, 2 of the people to whom you dedicate the book. If you could anticipate where you're going next, I'm interested in what criticisms you have of evolutionary psychology, and if that gives some sign of where your own thinking will be headed in the next years.
So the question would be criticisms of evolutionary psychology?
Yeah, and also, what new sources of inspiration or questions you're asking yourself which might predict what you're going to be working on for the next 5 years.
Well, although many people perceive the intellectual landscape as people who favor nature on one side and nurture on the other, there's actually, among the people the scientists who study nature, there's actually quite a divide between the behavioral geneticists and the evolutionary psychologists, even though they're often lumped together, but there are substantial disagreements both in methods and in subject matter. Evolutionary psychologists study pretty much what people have in common, universal human nature. Behavioral geneticists, to a large extent, study what makes one individual different from another individual. And there's, I think, tension between them. Evolutionary psychologists seldom cite behavioral geneticists, and much in the book is exploring some of the implications of behavioral genetics, that is, individual variation as well as universal human nature. I think that evolutionary psychology really shouldn't exist as a field. That is, all psychology should be evolutionary in the same sense that I don't think that, say, there used to be this field called physiological psychology or cognitive neuroscience, which also shouldn't exist as a field. That is, what we should study is aspects of the mind, such as the emotions, various cognitive abilities, language abilities, and so on, bringing to bear whatever source of insight is most productive. And so everything should be studied with some eye towards how it evolved, what function it serves, what its physiological basis is in the brain, how it develops in the child, and that by chopping the field up in terms of evolutionary psychology and the rest, just like chopping it up in terms of cognitive neuroscience and the rest, is likely to lead to disciplinary boundaries that have no reflection in the thing that we're actually studying that could only get in the way. So I'd like to see, as much as I'm a fan of evolutionary psychology, I'd like to see it disappear as a field in the same way that I'd like to see cognitive neuroscience disappear as a field, but simply get integrated into whatever we're studying.
Good, thank you. You and I are both aficionados of the arts and humanities, as sure most people here are. I guess I'm interested in the statement that you make in the book. We may be seeing a coming together of the humanities and the science of human nature. But the question I want to ask you is, you tend to focus very much on how science of various sorts can help us understand people's preferences in the arts and the things that you point out that most people don't like. Do the sciences have things to be learned from the arts and the humanities, or is it a one-way kind of connection?
Yeah, no, it's clearly not one way. I argue in the chapter on the arts, which is also, by the way, one of the most controversial chapters. I mean, forget gender, race, politics. What really gets people exercised is parents and children and the arts. And I'd say probably 80% of all of the feedback about the book has been on those two topics. And what I suggest is that the elite arts claim to be in trouble. There's been one article after another on the decline of the humanities, the decline of the arts. Paradoxically, in an age in which, at least in commercial terms, the arts have never been doing better. I mean, the price of opera tickets is one indication. The lines for blockbuster shows at the museum, the number of CDs shown, the number of movies released. The arts are flourishing, but it's the popular arts, and it's or the elite arts of 70 years ago and longer. Contemporary elite arts and humanities are what's in trouble. And the suggestion that I make is because they are the ones that are most militantly deny the existence of human nature. That when modernism and then postmodernism took a turn toward denying that there's any aesthetic, universal human aesthetic, that beauty was a obsolete and bourgeois concept, just a way of commodifying art, that people could be trained to appreciate any art form conforming to any compelling theory. And so you have the loss of melody in music, of beauty and form and representation in art, of plot and narrative in fiction and so on. Then the elite arts, I think, alienated themselves from the vast majority of humanity, and their self-declared decline, I think, came about through letting the popular arts and the older elite arts successfully compete for people's attention. Now, in terms of that would mean that if you look at what makes art successful, either successful in the short-term sense of commercially popular, or in the broader view of what art stands the test of time and continues to be compelling to people's aesthetics and people's emotions, that ought to give you insight into human nature. What are the themes in fiction that people find as compelling now as they did in when the Iliad or stories in the Bible were composed? What about Shakespeare allows it to be as popular now as it was in Elizabethan England? What allows Japanese art to transplant so well and capture people's attention? Or Southwest Native American geometric motifs? So I think there's a rich source of psychological data in terms of what works well across time and across space in the arts, since I think successful art works by appealing to what's common across human nature. And just to connect back to an earlier point in our discussion, what made Ian McEwan interested in these topics was that the novelist is that he had wrote a very interesting article in The Guardian saying that the ability of great works of literature to survive across millennia was a kind of proof of the existence of a common human nature, because we can appreciate narratives, say, from the Iliad or from Sophocles, and not have to take a tutorial as in terms of human emotions in, say, ancient Greece in order to understand the motives of the characters. With just a few sketches of what the characters did, we can fill in what they must have been thinking, what their competing motives must have been. And the fact that literature can be enjoyed across so many millennia and such radically different cultures suggests that there must be some common mode of construal of human behavior.
Of course, that argument is more convincing for literature than, say, for music, where it's often very difficult to appreciate the musics from another culture. Last question. Final thoughts for at least a venue, if not an audience, that is working every day, largely in pre-collegiate education, dealing with some of the questions that a few of the people have raised. Obviously, as people who are interested in the life of the mind, we wouldn't be here. We find this interesting, but does it really have implications for people who spend their time with kids in classrooms?
Only in a very general way, because I think in educational policy, as in political policy, so much depends on the details of what's being taught, and I think responsible advice could only come from actual studies of what works and what doesn't work. So I wouldn't want to give anything terribly concrete or specific in terms of recommendations for education, not having done research in this field itself. But just
that's, by the way, those statements are almost never made by people. So.
But I mean, a general approach, and I know this is one that you've raised in your own work, and that a number of people at Harvard have raised, such as Jean Chall, is that the romantic idea that you simply put children in a stimulating environment and knowledge and skills will spontaneously blossom is unlikely from an evolutionary point of view and from, I think, a realistic conception of human nature, simply because most of what we want kids to learn in school are things that there's no reason to believe our species is particularly good at, simply because the demand for those skills is so recent in human evolutionary history and so local to particular cultures, such as the ability to read, the ability to do formal math, the ability to appreciate science. There's no way that the human mind could have been selected for skill at reading, since written language is only a few thousand years old. And there may be reason to believe that, in fact, there are fantastically complex things that children do spontaneously, for which they don't have to go to school, such as recognizing facial expressions, or knowing how to walk and run and grasp and make friends and discern.
In parentheses, these are things which are very hard to get computers to do. So we know that it's interesting that kids don't need to be programmed externally to do those things.
Yes, exactly right. And that's a kind of evidence that what's going on in the child's mind is fantastically complex, and children indeed are complex creatures who will spontaneously develop certain skills without needing instruction. But math and reading and science and history are probably not among them, and that even though we'd like to think that learning is always fun, that children are born learners, that it's, I think, unlikely that leaving them to their own devices will result in them learning the things that we as parents and educators want them to end up with. And so this is kind of a brief for some role of structured instruction, of some kind of temporary pain and discomfort with the reward of mastery in the long run being the motivator, as opposed to it being pleasant every step along the way. So it's, I guess, a bit of a brief towards what might be called a more conservative approach to education, against some of the radical notions such as free schools of the Summerhill variety, whole language in reading, strong constructivism in math, and so on. And I think I feel sort of emboldened to even lean in that direction, because I think that some of the consensus is that when these techniques are studied quantitatively using the best methods available, it seems to suggest that you do need some kind of structure and instruction and breaking down skills into components, and that those are more successful empirically speaking, than the kind of Summerhill style.
Nonetheless, I think mostly would agree that having a articulate and charismatic teacher like Steve Pinker would make it easier for everybody. And while I don't know your agent, I'm sure Dottie and I are happy to invite you in advance to come and talk about your next book, whatever it is. Thanks very much.